A great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. A very warm welcome to Sundar Sarukkai. Very nice to meet you. How are you?
I don't know. Nice?
Not bad. Let's talk about philosophy. I was very curious. Because the other day I spoke to my friend Daniel Birnbaum, the current director of the Moderne Museum in Stockholm, one of the leading curators of our time. And Daniel is trained as a philosopher, and in his early work he wrote a PhD as a philosopher, which Ulrich considered to be seminal, but then he had the feeling that philosophy had to migrate into other fields, into art criticism, into art, into curating, and he talks a lot about this idea of philosophy going into exile. Lyotard going with Les Immatériaux into the world of exhibitions. Bruno Latour, as of lately, also gone more into the world of exhibitions. Wondering if you could tell us about your beginnings, your training in physics and philosophy, and if you would agree with Daniel about this whole exile idea of philosophy.
Well, I would agree with that. I think philosophy is always. Can you? Okay, let me use the other phone. Well, there was. Can you hear me now? I mean, is there the other? Okay, is this better? Okay, so I'll just hold it in hand. Yeah. No, that's all right. I'll just hold it in hand. Yeah, I think philosophy has always been in exile. It's not that philosophy goes into exile, because if you look at philosophy is always reflecting upon something else. It's philosophy of language, philosophy of science, philosophy of art, and so on. And I think what's interesting, situating it in the context here, is that if you look at traditions other than the Western traditions, other than the Greek, European tradition, philosophy has always been that. In fact, in the Indian context, for example, there is no equivalent translation of philosophy. If in Greek tradition philosophy translates as love of wisdom, there is no equivalent word in Indian and Chinese traditions to translate philosophy as love of wisdom. So in that sense, if you look at the larger world of philosophy, I think that's really why philosophy has any interest for any of us.
And when you started basically the philosopher, who were your heroes, who were your inspirations? Was it Western philosophy, was it Indian philosophy?
Well, when I was a teenager, I call Nietzsche a teenage philosopher. You read him when you're a teenager and you don't read him after that. And I think most of us as teenagers, now I think everybody reads Ayn Rand. Everybody thinks Ayn Rand when you're a teenager is a philosopher. Somehow I don't. But Nietzsche is a person who has very strong likes and dislikes about everything, right? In India, it's very difficult not to do Western philosophy if you're interested in philosophy. In fact, it might interest you to know that you cannot do a proper degree in India in philosophy. If there's one thing the Indian government and the education system has done very well, is to completely annihilate study of philosophy and in larger liberal arts in India. And it's extremely difficult to study Indian philosophy in India. So in fact, most of us who enter into philosophy engage with various other traditions, and it's only in recent times we have actually been looking at various traditions in Indian thought.
It's interesting because this connects. So I read this morning in the breakfast in the daily newspaper here. There's a big interview with Homi Bhabha, and he talks about the question if the humanities have declined in India. I quote here Homi Bhabha. He says, "Last night at dinner I was told a very dispiriting story by a deeply disturbed mother. Her brilliant son had opted for a humanities stream at one of Mumbai's leading schools. The school authorities summoned the parents to say that with such grades their son must follow a science or business-oriented curriculum." So obviously, given this situation, it's extremely interesting that you actually came from a training in hard science and then went into the humanities.
I think part of the reason is this. Growing up in India, Bangalore. I grew up in Bangalore. I did my college in Bangalore, and Bangalore is called the Silicon capital of India, whatever, right? In Bangalore today, nothing has changed in the last 25 years. In today, if you want to do a degree in philosophy, you can't do it. None of the colleges offer degree in philosophy, while you can do courses in any other subject. So the reason why one ends up doing science, I think, is because if you are reasonably good in mathematics or science, everybody thinks you have to do science, right? So the reason why I ended up doing philosophy was actually because I went to the US to study physics, and then I shifted into philosophy, and that's because of the university system.
Now going through your writings, there is a lot of writing about the relationship between science and language, which seems to be a major preoccupation. I was wondering, you say that similar to the suspicion which science has towards language, language itself harbors suspicion towards translation. You then go on to discuss science as primarily translators, or perhaps interpreters. So I was wondering if you could comment on implication of this argument for an interdisciplinary area. Marathon here,
Sure, right. No, I think the question about science is very problematical, and I think it's particularly problematical for the Indian context. It might interest you to know that among all the countries in the world, it's only the Indian constitution which has as a duty of a citizen to have a scientific temper. I mean, it's one of the most interesting paradoxes that the Indian constitution, out of the 8 duties or something like that which we have, one of them is that we, whoever is an Indian citizen here, it's our duty to have the scientific temper, and nobody knows what a scientific temper is. Absolutely, nobody has a clue what scientific temper is. In India, this is to me the greatest challenge of understanding contemporary India, because it has serious reflections on art practice, as I've argued elsewhere. The point is this, on the one hand, you have a space research organization, which is one of the most successful science institutions in the country. Every time before they have a launch of a satellite or the rocket, their scientists take a model of the satellite to the Tirupati temple. They actually do 2 things. I just discovered last year that they take one model to a temple near the university where I am in, Dharmasthala, Manjunatheshwara temple, and the other people in Sriharikota take it to Tirupati temple. And last July, if you see, the chairman of ISRO goes with 10 of his scientists to offer prayers to the satellite before you launch it. I mean, people actually see, like, the response is that it's funny. I mean, you think that's not science. But my point is that shows exactly the problem in the Indian context of the Indian imagination of science.
That's these facts. I found this fabulous text here by you, which is extraordinary, called The Deity in the Engine. That's that story, no? The idea of the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. You talk here about technology taking the round of the temple. Can you tell us about this text? It's called The Believers.
Yeah, this was a piece in Outlook, some issue. Actually, this is a very interesting story, because near Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, there is a small temple. I mean, it used to be just a rock, which has now become very popular. Those of you from Bangalore will see that near the subway entrance is a huge temple now. And they created the entrance because the main entrance was causing a lot of accidents, and some of the faculty died due to the accidents. So every time we used to enter, my institute was in the campus, and so every time we would enter through the subway, that entrance near the temple. And that temple, that circle where you turn, is called Marama temple. The temple names the circle. It's become so popular. And why is it popular? Because people come to worship cars and vehicles, and that's a common practice I'm sure all of you have seen. Now, to me, the real interest was not that. One day I was waiting to enter into the campus, and I was just looking at because everybody knows that circle is called Marama circle, the name after the goddess. And in the side, I see right outside the IISc gate an yellow board, which is the Bangalore municipality board, the official board or the name of the circle. And it was a shock to me, because for years I had been going through it, I had never heard the real name of the circle. You know what the name of the circle was? It's Sir C.V. Raman circle. C.V. Raman is our Nobel Prize winning physicist. The poor chap was displaced by a new goddess who had just come recently, and even postmen call that circle as Marama circle. Nobody knows it's C.V. Raman circle. To me, the point was that entry into the Science Institute shows this paradox between science and religion in India. Just to extend it into this context, very similar paradoxes lie between art and religion. The kind of dichotomy we have, right, between science, art, religion, etc., does not seem to happen in our society, and we need to make sense of that.
It's interesting because also many artists have been inspired by science. Duchamp was very inspired by Poincaré, for example. Hans Magnus Enzensberger wrote a lot about the connection between poetry and mathematics. And obviously, in the Indian context, there is an incredible history of mathematics speculation, and I was wondering, from your point of view, what's the state of mathematical speculation in India today, and what's exciting today for you in mathematics and physics? Because I think it could be interesting to hear for the art audience, because maybe there is inspiration.
Sure, yeah. No, I think I'm glad you asked the question about mathematics, because perhaps if there is any one discipline which comes closest to art, it's mathematics. You know, both of them are fictitious, both of them have nothing to do with the real world. I'm saying it with a little bit of tongue in cheek, but both of them think they are about truth. This is really the paradox, because the model for truth in all philosophical traditions is mathematics. And if you look at the model for truth in all contemporary philosophical, particularly the continental philosophical tradition, it's art. Whether it's from Heidegger, Husserl, Gadamer, their whole engagement of truth comes from art, whereas for a completely different tradition, the idea of truth comes from mathematics. And both mathematicians and artists are crazy creatures, right? You know that well. They share a particular way of vision of the world which is very different. And I think what happens with the case of mathematics is, this is a question which scientists have been asking for a very long time. It starts with, Newton, it comes up to Einstein says it, Newton says it, which is that without mathematics there is no modern science. But scientists just don't know why mathematics is so important. They call it the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. To them it seems mysterious why mathematics should be relevant to sciences. And this has become a major mystery. See, to me, what is of interest here is just this. How it just points out to the fact that a lot of knowledge, which we think is a very good model for knowledge, is based on ignorance. Ignorance is a great driver of knowledge. That is, in other words, modern science is built on the edifice of mathematics, of which scientists know nothing about. That might sound a bit strong, but that's really what the status. So in other words, what is, I think, very interesting for all of us is, how is it that scientists use something which they don't understand what it is, but yet creates so much of what they think is valid knowledge?
Great. I have one more question, which is, given your incredibly broad interest and your very transdisciplinary practice, I was wondering what now in January 2011 you are most interested in.
Well, I'm just finishing a book along with a colleague here at JNU. That's something which is tied in not just to work with sciences but also with art, and that's actually on the idea of ethics in science and art. And this is a very serious problematical question for us, and I think in the case of science, very quickly, there's a very interesting story about why ethics has been divorced from science. And if you ask people why they do science, scientists very often say, I just invented a knife which can be used to cut a vegetable, but it can also be used to kill a man. Don't ask me, it's not my mistake. The atom bomb example, any of the cloning and anything else, right? Now, we have been trying for a long time now, I've been building up a theoretical framework to critique this view of scientists that they are not responsible for the knowledge they create. And much of the way they escape, the best way they escape from asking this ethical question is to say, I'm just curious. I'm curious about why the world is. So it is there in which I locate this problem about ethics in art and ethics in science. Is a scientist responsible for her thoughts? Is she in any sense responsible for having a thought? Forget about building technology from it. Does an individual have complete freedom to think about whatever they want? Now that question, it comes back in the context of art, because it's only art and science which consciously develop the idea of the individual who is not answerable to ethical concerns. It's only science and art. So art needs it in an extremely different sense. It doesn't want anybody to tell you what you as an artist should practice. Scientists at the same hand do not want anybody else to tell you what you should think about, what you should be curious about the world about. That, to me, I think you heard Vandana Shiva. And I know in the Indian context, given the ambiguity of science practice in India, it's impacted the society to a great extent. And the only way for us to recapture some kind of control over science and technology in India, because unlike the West, we do not have the control of science and technology. I mean, what Vandana Shiva was saying is a poignant example. There are hundreds of cases of that kind in India. we need to bring back the question of responsibility and ethics into scientific institution and scientific academic practice.
So that will be your next book?
That is, in the context of socialism, that's the next book.
And do you have any utopic projects or unrealized projects? What are your
unrealized projects? Yeah, one very major unrealized project. Well, it's partly, my previous book partly addresses it. It is the fact that we still remain a colonized nation as far as our intellect is concerned. We today in India, if you look at Indian society, description of Indian society, we still wait for the conceptual vocabulary from the European thinkers to be able to understand our society. Let me just share with you a very wonderful point made by Bruno Latour, a very well-known French science studies person. You know, I was just, when he had visited Bangalore, I was telling him about how so many students use his work. And I asked him, aren't you surprised that in India people find your work, which you have written in the context of France, so relevant? You know what he said? He said, you know, he's a very nice guy, he's not trying to be rude. He said, you know, he sounds like a French guy, but he said, frankly, I don't care about India. He said, I don't understand my society. I create framework to make sense of my society. You know what's happened in India? We haven't done that. We have not become independent thinkers, which allows us to reflect on our social practices. Whether it's a practice in art. I mean, look at how many art history students will tell you. We still don't have a coherent theoretical discipline in which to make sense of art in India. We don't have that in social sciences. We don't have it in the sciences. I think this colonization of the theoretical mind, I think it's a terrible, terrible thing. I mean, we are nowhere close to, forget about shining India, and I'm sure you're not going to ask me that question, but you know, forget about all that. We are nowhere close to that. We just don't know how to think. I mean, that's a very, and we train that to all our students, and more number of students who go and study science and technology in our country, we are continuing that. What we need are very good liberal arts and humanities education, and we have just started one in our university. So that's the advertisement.
Sundar, Sarukkai, thank you very, very much. Thanks a lot. Very good to meet you. Thank you.